After the Civil War, the South was a devastated region. So many of its businesses and farms and factories had been destroyed by the war. At the same time, there was no capital or cash in the post-war Confederacy. The Confederate currency was worthless. And so it would take a long time for the South to recover its economic growth and also its social and political stability. During the 1870s and 1880s, however, a number of civic and corporate leaders in the South began to talk about what they called the New South. And they promoted this vision of a New South. And what they meant by that was that the Old South, that is the South before the Civil War, was dominated by the cotton economy. And the South was too preoccupied with its agricultural sector at the expense of developing its own industry, its own factories, its own mills. And as a result, the South did not have a diversified economy. So the New South, the proponents of the New South, wanted the post-war South to develop a diversified economy just as was the case in the Northeast. So they promoted the development of Southern industry, Southern factories, Southern textile mills, and at the same time, they promoted the development of a Southern agriculture that was not solely focused on cotton, but was more diversified with all sorts of crops. They also assumed that the New South that they were promoting would include stable race relations between whites and blacks. This ideal, this myth of the New South became commonplace in the major cities of the South, in Atlanta, in Richmond, in New Orleans. They were all advocates of the New South in those cities. But unfortunately, the dynamics of the situation in the post-war South were such that the New South never really emerged during the last quarter of the 19th century. Yes, there was a little bit of industrial development and the growth of mills, and there was some diversification of Southern agriculture, but never to the extent that was envisioned by the promoters of the New South. The foremost promoter of the New South ideal was the editor of the Atlanta newspaper, a man named Henry Grady. And he gave very impassioned speeches, not just in the South, but also in New York and the Northeast, talking about his dream of a South that would be more diversified in its economy and more harmonious in its race relations. That dream did not appear during Henry Grady's lifetime, but ironically, 100 years later, in the 1970s and the 1980s, the New South did emerge, with the dramatic economic growth in the so-called Sun Belt states of the South and the Southwest, and the surge of prosperity and migration into the South, and the diversification of the Southern economy, it finally came to pass in the 1980s as opposed to the 1880s.